Hello and welcome to the Bedroom Studios podcast, the podcast where we talk about what goes on behind the scenes in a musician's world and bridge the industry gap by bringing their stories, expertise, and advice to early career artists. Subscribe to join us for a fun chat about life as a creative person, tips and tricks for pursuing an artistic career, navigating the music industry, and more. I am your host, Emma, and today I will be interviewing Emily Green. Emily Green is a composer born in Ottawa and is currently studying at the Manhattan School of Music. I personally know Emily from our studies at the University of Toronto, where she received her bachelors of music and composition and voice. Emily has had several pieces performed and commissioned by choirs such as the Ottawa Regional Youth Choir, the Capital Chamber Choir, the Elmer Iseler Singers, the University of Toronto's Concreamus Chamber Choir, and the Myriad Women's Choir. I had such an amazing conversation with Emily, and I definitely learned so much. We spoke about her journey as both a singer and a composer, her experience pursuing composition at the post-secondary level, and also her tips for networking and building a career as a composer. If you are someone who is looking to pursue composition at a more serious level, this episode is definitely for you. So I hope you enjoy this episode of the Bedroom Studios podcast with our guest, Emily Green. So hello, I'm so glad
Thank you so much for having me.
So just to jump right into it, what events led you to where you are now, and what led you to study music and want to pursue it as a career?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually started out as a piano student when I was really young. My grandparents who lived in Nova Scotia at the time had this like old piano, and whenever we would go to visit them, my mom noticed that I was always really interested in the piano, so she put me in piano lessons, and I pretty much did that until I was sort of like in my pre-teen years. But I always really loved to sing too, and especially loved the idea of singing in a choir. But the thing was that we lived way out in this suburb of Ottawa called Stittsville, and there weren't any really good choirs that were nearby. But then eventually I went to middle school sort of closer to downtown. So my mom figured that now was a good time to put me in a choir since it was easy for me to get there from school after school. And I just fell in love with singing in choirs. And towards like partway through high school, I decided that I did like playing the piano, but I kind of knew that I was never going to be like super good at it. I was okay because I practiced, but I don't really have, I'm not very coordinated with my hands and my fingers. So I decided to kind of switch gears and focus more on the singing. And I actually started taking voice lessons in grade 11, which is pretty late for someone who's a voice major. But um, in high school, I also had a choir director who was really supportive of my interest in composition, and I was very lucky that he even agreed to have the choir sing some of my works. And I think that's a huge part of the reason why I decided to apply to U of T for composition. And I think having that in my portfolio already from high school was probably part of a big reason why I was accepted into the composition program too. So I have my high school choir director, Jamie Loback, and so many other people who were really supportive of my interest in composition to thank for that. Yeah, and then I just am graduating this year from my undergrad, and I'm going to be starting at the Manhattan School of Music next year for a master's in composition.
Congratulations!
Yeah.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, I'm super excited.
That's so interesting though, because I always assumed that you had just been singing and taking voice lessons all your life, just because I've heard you sing before and you're really good.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I guess I have been singing all my life. I think that would be a pretty fair thing to say. But yeah, I didn't actually start taking, and I think also, I mean, I learned a lot from being in choirs too, but I didn't actually start taking like one-on-one private voice lessons till partway through high school.
That was the same with me for flute. I didn't start taking lessons until much later. I also found it interesting because, like, how were you exposed to choirs when you were younger? Because I guess like it depends on if you're I don't know if you're like if your parents really like choirs or something. But I know for me, like that was not something I was exposed to as a kid. It's not something that you would hear on the radio.
Yeah, totally. And like, you know what? I actually personally don't even remember exactly what it was that exposed me to that. I know that my mom did sing in choirs growing up, but she certainly never like really talked about it a ton or anything like that. But it must have been that I just saw a choir somewhere once. I would
Mm.
probably actually have to ask my parents about that. They would probably remember better than me. But yeah, it must have been that I saw a choir live at some point somewhere and just was really interested in doing that.
Nice. And so it was more of like you fell in love with choir first and then composing for choir is sort of like a natural progression of that, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I kind of had sort of always been like vaguely interested in composition, but I think it never really sort of occurred to me as like something that I could do, especially not something that I could, study and do like in university until much later. Yeah.
Now that you've been doing it for a really long time, is there like a process that or an approach that you use when you're composing a piece, or does it change?
I think it does change. And actually, I mean, funny enough, to me, it still, I feel like, doesn't feel like I've been doing it for a really long time, even though I guess maybe I
Mm.
have by now. But I didn't really start seriously composing again until like partway through high school, which is a lot later than a lot of other people that I know. But I think my process changes a lot depending on whether I'm working with text or not. I write a lot for
Mm.
the voice. And if I am using text, I think that like sort of influences my process a lot, and I sort of use that as a starting point and sort of go from there. And then if I'm not using text, then it's a totally different process. But I think I'm still sort of figuring out what works best for me and trying to come up with a really sort of reliable and like consistent writing process and even like a writing schedule, trying to just be more consistent about sitting down to write as often
Mm.
as possible. So I think that's definitely still sort of like a journey that I'm on.
Yeah, no, I can relate. It's I always like think of this. I don't think it's an actual quote, but it's like the nice thing about being about making music is the music, but the not so nice thing is the fact that you actually have to make it.
Yeah, yeah, I really love this is like, and I feel like if you ask pretty much any composer, they'll say something similar. But I mean, some people are lucky and they just have a really, really good relationship with the actual process of writing. But I know a lot of
Mm.
composers and definitely myself where like I really love having written something and I don't at this point I feel like I don't always love like actually sitting down to write, but the just like it's so worth it to have a finished piece and like to hear it performed. But yeah, I definitely prefer having written something over like writing.
Yeah. I find that I can start things, but I have so much trouble finishing them. Do you
Yeah,
also experience that?
totally. In like every aspect of my life too, not just music. I get so excited about things and then I start all these projects and I feel like I want to say like 80% like it's lucky the lucky 20% of them that I finish. But um obviously with composition I try to be a lot better about that and finishing things that I start, especially because so much of the work goes into actually just starting something. So kind of like a I find it, I try to be really intentional about what projects I start and making sure that I'm really willing to finish them when it comes to composition. But I also feel like a lot of composers sort of go through these like different phases at different parts of the writing process, if that makes sense. Like for
Mm.
me, when I start something out, I'm obviously, really excited about it and I have all these ideas and it's about sort of narrowing down those ideas to sort of really get started. And then usually about like 20% of the way through the project, I'm like, okay, feeling really good about this. And then at least for me and a lot of other composers that I've talked to, like at about the halfway point, you just get this feeling of like, what if this is actually the worst piece in the world?
Yeah.
and then and then you keep going and then like when it's almost done, you start to feel better about it again and then it's finished and then sometimes you get a second wave of like, wait, what if this is actually really bad? And then, eventually you sort of get over it. But it's a very sort of up and down process, I find.
Yeah. And so like in those moments where you're in that everything is garbage phase, is
Truly,
there
yeah.
yeah, what helps you to push through that period in the writing process?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like one part of it is just sort of like understanding now that that's just sort of like how my process goes and, that I'll get over it and that everything's gonna be okay, even if it doesn't feel like it at the moment. And then
Mm.
also just, I think, sort of what we were talking about before of like, I have started this project and I feel like sometimes just like the will to finish it regardless of how I feel about it sort of helps me,
Mhm.
just soldier on and finish the piece. And then also, I mean, not as glamorous, but I have composition lessons every week and I have to bring something into them. So
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, it's definitely that like the pressure of school will
yeah.
that'll do it. Um, this is more of a personal question like that
Oh,
I'm just really curious about in general, but
mm.
do you when you write, do you like think very consciously about music theory and be like, I want this kind of feeling, and so I'm going to use this chord to create this feeling? Or do you sort of just like, just write how you feel, or do you go back to it later with a more theoretical lens? Like, I'm just wondering, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely a little bit of both, depending on the situation. I definitely do rely a lot on my knowledge of music theory, but less to like sort of, like follow the rules and more just to sort of like create the effects that I want. Like I sort of don't really buy it when people say that you don't need to know music theory to write music. I mean, I think you still can, but it certainly makes it a lot easier when you do know music theory so that you know like this is the sound in my head that I want and I know how to achieve that on paper. So definitely I think that helps me a lot in terms of just like the efficiency of like knowing what I want. And also I think having like an awareness of the repertoire is super important, even if obviously you're not going to write like Beethoven wrote or like Mozart wrote or like Debussy wrote. Or maybe you are, and that's great too, but like just sort of having an awareness of those traditions and which traditions you sort of want to emulate in your own music and which ones you don't, and just like how your own music fits into, the greater world, I
Mhm.
think is important. But often I do sort of just, try some things out and do what's cool. And I think that's also a big part of writing. At composition forum one time, someone was saying, I forget who it is. I wish I remembered so that I could give them credit for their awesome idea. But they were saying that they had heard that there's what was it? There's the child and the academic essentially, or we'll say the child and the academic, and they're both sort of making decisions um, about the piece, and the child is the sort of oh, just like what sounds cool or what like my gut instinct, and then the academic is the one who says like, oh well, like what if like make sure the form is good and make sure the structure and everything, like all the sort of more music theory related and sort of like stuff that involves sort of more left brain thinking. But then he said the most important thing that I sort of realized was that you also need to have a third role, which is the contractor, and the contractor decides whether the child or the academic gets to decide about any given thing. And that was really a cool thing for me to hear, and that was really eye opening. Of like, oh yeah, like I guess it is important to sort of have a process of deciding like, okay, am I going to approach this from sort of like an analytical standpoint or just from like a gut instinct standpoint.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool. I guess it's like that's I feel like being in a very academic environment in university, it can really sway. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I felt like for me it was I felt like because maybe like there was an area of music theory that I wasn't as strong in, or I didn't know how to sort of bridge the knowledge of like music theory courses and apply them to composition, and so I felt like I was doing something wrong just inherently because I didn't have as that analytical theoretical approach to composition wasn't as developed. But it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting hearing you talk about how, both perspectives can be valid.
Yeah, and I think they're both super important
Hmm.
because I mean like it's if you don't have that sort of like gut instinct, you have to have something to say.
Yeah.
And I think that really comes from like the inner child gut instinct part of you. And if you're only using the sort of like analytical part of yourself, you're just, I don't know, doing a theory exercise, right?
Yeah, for sure. Did you find that your composition teachers were supportive of trying different things and expressing your inner voice, or did they want you to sort of stick to one type of style?
I mean, let's see, I've had four composition teachers over my time at U of T, and they were all really different. And, it depends on the teacher. Some of them are sort of really open to whatever kind of style you want to write in, and some of them um, have their own kind of ideas about how you should write. And I think both of those approaches are valid. It just sort of depends on what you want out of your lessons. Do you really want to sort of like follow in someone's footsteps and emulate their style, or do you want someone who will sort of let you do what you want, but sort of just help you try and do that in the best way possible? And I find that I sort of maybe more lean towards I prefer to have a teacher who helps me do what I already know I want to do in the best way possible, instead of sort of like telling me what they think I should do.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I think it you really sort of have to like develop a relationship with your teacher too. And I think with composition, it's a bit different from like instrument lessons or voice lessons, because in instrumental technique or vocal technique, to a certain extent, obviously, this is not like 100%, but for the most part, like there is a correct technique and an incorrect technique for
mm,
like how to play the flute, for example. And your teacher's job is to sort of help you get get better, for lack of a better way to put it. But then for composition, there's not it's not always as clear cut, and like there are good compositional techniques and maybe not so effective compositional techniques, but it's a much more sort of broad thing. So you sort of have to communicate with your teacher about what you want to get out of your lessons, and what parts of your writing are like you're saying like, oh, this is what I want to do, and I'm sort of not willing to budge on this, versus like what kinds of things you're more looking for feedback about. And one of my teachers last year, Iman Habibi, would even say like, anything I tell you, like you're allowed to not do it.
mm.
Um, which obviously you wouldn't really hear that from like a flute lesson or a voice lesson.
Yeah.
Um, but composition lessons are kind of different that way, because he said like, it's possible that I just don't understand what you're trying to do. And if you feel that way, then, why wouldn't you just keep doing what you want to do? And he told a story about, one of his own teachers, I forget who you would bring your notation software into his lesson, and then he would change it, like he would tell you what he wanted you to do, and then he would actually change it in the notation software for him. And the point of his story was like, and like, do you dare bring back the old version at the next lesson? Like, obviously not, right? And then he said that he sort of felt that was, I guess, suffocating, and he wanted to have a much freer approach to his lesson. So yeah, it really depends on the
Mm.
teacher, I think.
Yeah, and I guess it's nice that you've had a lot of different teachers with different styles throughout the past years, and it kind of forms you into like taking just the best parts of what you liked from each teacher.
Yeah, totally. I think that's like the best part. And even from teachers, like I've had some teachers who I enjoyed my time with a little bit less, but they still, taught me some valuable things, and there were still lots of sort of positive things that I was able to take from that. So yeah.
Hmm. And I wanted to ask you some questions about, I guess, like beginning your career as a musician, as a composer.
In terms of like, so summer festivals, a little bit of both actually. Some summer festivals I've heard that they're good, and I applied for them, and pretty standard process. And then others, usually it's like a teacher who says, hey, either they I did this festival when I was a student and I think it's really great and you should apply, and I'll write you a recommendation letter. Or it's teachers who say, hey, like, I have a part in running this festival. A lot of the time they're like affiliated with different summer festivals,
Mm,
and they'll say, it would be really great if you applied. And often they're looking for more applicants, so they'll reach out to students that they know who they think would be a good fit. So a little bit of both. But then in terms of like the commissions that I've done for choirs, I will say that it's all connections. Like I feel like
mm,
even me when I was younger, I had this sort of idea that like eventually if I if I was successful, then there would just be people sort of reaching out to me from nowhere and asking me to do stuff for them. And who knows, maybe that's still something that happens. But I found that much more frequently, it really, really has to do with the connections that you have. Like most, I think all but one of the commissions that I have ever done have been for choirs that I personally have sung in before.
Mm.
Um, and so I think, yeah, connections are super, super important. And even like, the most recent summer festival that I did last summer called Atlantic Music Festival, it was, first of all, these festivals unfortunately are not the most accessible in that they're pretty expensive. Thankfully, I was able to get some funding from U of T to go. But when I talked to, my teacher and other people who had been to this festival, they all told me, no, it's worth it because you're paying for meeting all these important people. And sure enough, one of the people that I met at that festival is going to be my composition teacher next year at MSM. And I'm sure that
That's so
that
exciting.
probably, helped me get in. And, when someone sees your application and they recognize your name, that's huge, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think, I guess, fortunately and unfortunately, it really is all about those connections. And, obviously, not everyone is fortunate enough to be able to go to these summer festivals and to make these connections for one reason or another. But if you can, I think that's a really big part of having success as a composer. That, and I
Mm.
think promoting your own work, like social media, which I'm terrible at, but I'm trying my best to be better at it.
Yeah, I find it so hard to be super active on social media when I'm also trying to be creative because
Mhm.
it takes up so much space in my brain.
Yeah.
And like, I was recording a lot of stuff these past 2 weeks, and I was like kept on in the back of my mind. I kept on being like, oh, like I should take a video or like film some stuff so I can use it for quote unquote content later. But I couldn't do it because if I were to start filming stuff and filming the process, it just would take for me. It just takes away from the experience of actually being in the moment. And I'm like, it's like I kind of want to just focus on what I'm doing now, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I'm totally on the same page as you with that too. And like also I feel like for me I can be really I guess like perfectionistic and like there's always going to be some works that I'm more proud of than others, or for you and actually for me too, there's always going to be some performances that we're more proud of than others. And I think it's really hard when I sort of like realize and like tell myself like it's still like you still have to advertise everything, even the performance that you felt like you could have done better on. It's still better to like put that on social media than to not talk about it at all. And I think that's something that's really hard for me, where if I have a performance of a piece of mine that I feel didn't go as well as I had hoped, or just even I'm not as happy with the piece itself as I had hoped, to still like force myself to put it out there and put it on social media can be difficult.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about how short form content is really popular now is that
Yeah.
if something didn't go that well, you can just take the best part and put
Yeah,
that 15-second clip.
yeah, that's for sure a benefit. But then it's also a drawback too, because how do you choose the best 5 seconds of a
That's so
performance or of a
true.
piece? And how do you try your best to choose something that's gonna like sort of represent the whole thing as best as you can?
Yeah, that's so true.
So annoying that we have to do this, but I think
Yeah.
it's part of self promotion and stuff.
I remember when I first started putting my stuff on social media, I had a bit of resentment towards needing some sort of visual or video to accompany it. I was like, oh, why can't I just put my audio on? Because I worked so hard on the audio, and then now I have to do more work and make a video. But I don't know. At the same time, I find it's now that I'm a bit more used to it. It's sort of interesting to reimagine the sound in a visual way.
That's interesting. I've never really thought of the idea of like sort of having a visual way to um sort of like accompany whatever music I'm posting. Because I normally just post like, whatever, if it's a choral piece, I'll just like post the video of the choir singing it, or sometimes if I don't have good video, I'll even just post like a black screen. Um,
Mm.
but that's a really interesting idea of like trying to find some sort of artwork or something that will go with it.
I just wanted to circle back to we were talking about networking, and I was wondering if you just had any general advice for, like, obviously you've made a lot of connections through studying composition at school, but other than that, do you have any advice for meeting new people? And you mentioned summer festivals, which is a great one.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, applying to things is always good. I think just like trying your best to be an active member of like whatever community that you're a part of. So like, at when I was studying at U of T, I didn't just sing in the U of T choirs. I tried to find choirs like outside to sing in as well, which I know that that's sort of a big time commitment, but if you can find things that you enjoy doing as well, that would be one thing. And then also, I think something that was like scary for me was that when I was moving to Toronto from Ottawa, I was like, oh, I already have all these connections in Ottawa, and I'm afraid that once I move to Toronto, like those are gonna sort of fade away, and then I'm gonna have to start over. And then now I'm sort of experiencing that same thing about moving to New York. But
Yeah.
um, I've realized that like it usually works out okay, and I still have those connections from Ottawa, and I still will have those connections that I made in Toronto, and like expanding your sort of bubble is never going to be a bad thing.
Yeah, and I guess it's nice as a composer because you can still do work for people remotely, and you don't have to be in the same room as someone like you would have to if you're like a performer. Um,
Yeah,
right? So like people could still be like, "Hey, Emily, can you write me a piece?" And you could be across the world and be like, "Yeah, sure."
yeah. I mean, okay, that is true, but actually that makes me think of another point though, which is composers have to sort of be careful for that reason because it's kind of like I've realized it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind. So I think one thing that is really important is that like even when you're no longer interacting with a certain person or group on like a regular basis, to still keep in touch with them. Um, because I think it's really easy for them to just like forget about you, even if they don't mean to, right? Like everyone is super busy and they have so many things on their minds. So even just an email to like reach out and say, hey, like, how's it going? I saw that you were doing, this and this and this, whatever you can find on social media about them, and like just to keep that connection because I
Mhm.
think it is really easy for like as soon as you're not living in the same place anymore for connections to just sort of like fizzle out if you don't keep in touch. So yeah, keeping in touch I think is a good thing. And I think sometimes I get nervous about doing that and feeling like this is so random that I'm just like reaching out to them and like, will they think it's weird? But if you think of it from your perspective, like I'm never like when someone who I haven't seen in a while emails me, I never think like, oh, that's so random and weird. I'm always happy to hear from them, right?
Yeah,
So why would it be any different for other people?
yeah. Sometimes sometimes it's nice to be on the receiving end of like someone being proactive. So that's a really good point of like
Mhm.
no one's gonna be like, "Ew, who's this person?" It's like
Yeah,
no.
exactly.
Can you
Yeah.
imagine? Oh, I guess that's probably a person you wouldn't want to keep having that
Exactly,
connection
yeah.
with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you were applying for your master's, I assume you had to create like a portfolio and like how did you decide what to include in that?
Yeah, it was a crazy process, first of all, just like, there's so much stuff to do and I mean, I'm glad I didn't have to like I feel like we have it a little bit easier than you guys because I did have like an audition with air quotes, but it was more of an interview than anything. I
Mhm.
could never like the idea of preparing like repertoire for an audition. I did that for my U of T audition for voice, but it was really stressful and I wouldn't want to do it again. But um, yeah, preparing a portfolio comes with, I guess, its own stress because I think the first, I guess, problem is that whatever recordings because you're supposed to send in like performance recordings of your work too, and whatever performance recordings you have of your work, like that's what you have, and you can't practice and make it better. You can't like, touch it up or polish it up. Um, you just have to sort of go with whatever you have. So that can be definitely stressful. Um, and then I feel like choosing the works, yeah, is a big thing because a lot of schools, especially for the pre-screening, they only ask for like two works. So you're picking two works that are usually they want them to be contrasting, like for different ensembles, for different different moods, different instruments. And so it's like a matter of how do I give them two sort of different pieces that both still showcase sort of my voice as a composer.
Mhm.
Um, and often you're picking excerpts from those pieces too, because they don't have time to listen to everyone's, 8 minute, 2 8 minute pieces, right? Um, so I think it's kind of this, actually, it's sort of, that's really interesting. I'm just sort of realizing this now, but I guess it's kind of the same as when you're trying to put yourself out there on social media where people are
Yeah.
scrolling and they have, really short attention spans and they're not going to listen to your, 7 minute long clips. So you're picking, the best 45 seconds. You're trying to make it look as good as possible for composers specifically. And maybe I'm a bit of a hypocrite because I'm not the best proofreader in terms of my scores, but I think like your engraving is really important because if they
Mm.
open your score and it looks really polished, like even before they look at the content of it and what music is in there, just like if the score looks really polished, then that will automatically be a good first impression. And then vice versa, if they, if they open your score and there's all sorts of collisions and notation errors and stuff, it doesn't matter how good your music is. It's not gonna, make a good impression on them if your score is super messy. Um,
Mhm.
so even getting a friend like look at it, I think is a really good way to do it. Like I find that I'm so much better at proofreading other people's scores than my own scores because I've been staring at my own scores for like hours and hours, so I don't really notice things that are out of place, but someone like a fresh pair of eyes will. Um, so I think that's sort of my main advice. And then just like be yourself, which is kind of cheesy and like cliche advice, but um I feel like when you go to your interviews or when people are looking at your music, like they're genuinely interested in your music and they want you to succeed, and nobody's sort of like out to get you, I guess.
Yeah. Do you find that because of the way that things are presented on social media and how everything's really short and clipped down, do you find that like you sometimes feel pressured to write things that are shorter and more concise, or is kind of the community of musicians and people who will actually come to a concert, is that does that feel like I guess sort of separated from what you have to do on social media?
Yeah, I think it is separated, especially because like I'm just so bad with social media in general that when I'm like I don't think I'm ever really thinking of social media when I'm writing a piece.
Mm,
But something kind of similar, I guess, to what you were asking that is it like a huge thing is that when I'm writing a piece of music, you have to think about whether it's like how it's going to get performed,
mm,
which is kind of an unfortunate truth of like if I want to write a piece for like two full orchestras and choir and ballet, like that's maybe not. I mean, that would sound super cool, and I would love to do that, but it's not the most feasible if I want to realistically get it performed. And so I think a lot of student composers, and I think this is maybe actually like an issue that needs to be addressed, but is that we tend to gravitate towards writing a lot more solo or chamber music just because that's the easiest stuff to get a good performance of. And I
mm,
think that it would be really great if there were more outlets um, for readings from larger actually, and this is my other point is not just readings but actually like well rehearsed professional performances of pieces for larger ensembles. um I think that's something that's seriously lacking, especially, and I'm not here to bash U of T. I had a really great
mm.
experience there, but especially at U of T, there's a reason that all of the student composer concerts are filled with solo and chamber works, and it's because it's really hard to get a full orchestra on stage
Yeah.
to perform your orchestral work. And then length does factor into it too in that case, because if you are writing an orchestral work and you're lucky enough to have an opportunity for it to get performed, often an orchestra is more willing to say yes to rehearse like a 2 to 5 minute piece than anything longer than that.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny because all of the larger ensembles that I know of that have performed student works are usually ensembles that the students have formed themselves.
Yeah,
Like, and I know
yeah.
you've
And
part of
students
a
do
lot of
like, yeah, that's how for people listening who maybe don't know what we're referring to, I sing or used to sing in a choir called Concreamus, and it's meant to exactly do that, to perform student choral works and sometimes works by alumni as well. And yeah, that's why a lot of these groups are formed, is that, the conductor Kai was was tired of having, performances of choral works that were like maybe rehearsed once or twice by like a pickup group of singers, and performance usually didn't turn out to be um, representative or do justice to the amazing piece that was written by the composer. And so he made this group so that there could actually be, well rehearsed, professionally presented performances. Wow, that's a great alliteration of student choral works. And I know other people who have done similar things, like Ricardo, who graduated not this year but last year. He started an orchestra because for actually a slightly different purpose, he needed material for his conducting auditions, and that meant that he needed footage of him conducting an orchestra, which wasn't really something that he had any opportunities to do. So he made his own orchestra, and with his friend Evan, and Evan had the orchestra perform one of his pieces as well. So yeah, there's a lot of students who are sort of like creating these groups just out of the pure necessity for groups who will perform like larger ensembles who will perform student works. But it would be even then, the quality of like a bunch of students who aren't getting paid and who aren't getting a credit for showing up to rehearsals is never going to be as good as like an actual class or university endorsed ensemble. So I think that that's something that is sort of lacking. And these ensembles do have reading sessions, but again, like they're reading sessions. UTSO will spend like 10, 15 minutes on a 5-minute piece and then try and record it, and it's never going to be perfect.
Definitely something that I think would be cool to have more collaboration between the different, like the performance students and the composition students, and collaboration and networking be more integrated into the program. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome.
Because really, it's like nothing musical. It really exists in a bubble. If you're
Yeah,
composing,
totally.
you need players. If you're playing music, you need a piece to play.
Well, also, I think another thing that is like really great is when students are willing to perform new works, because I know
Mm.
like a lot of people, and I can understand why, are kind of scared to do that. But composers love writing pieces for, their friends and their colleagues. And whenever I find like a good player who's willing to perform my work, immediately I'm like, oh, can I please write everything for you now? And like, who doesn't want to perform a piece that was written specifically for them? Like that's so cool. And I feel like maybe a lot of performers don't even really realize that that's like a possibility. But yeah, performers, make friends with your fellow composition students because they really want to write pieces for you.
Yeah, it's funny because I find, I guess, especially with classical music, I feel like there's often that like perception of like, oh, you're a composer, you would probably write like 12 tone, atonal music, contemporary music, but that's not like there's so much variety throughout all of the composers that like I've met at U of T. I'm sure you can agree.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, like, you know what, even if it is like 12 tone atonal or like, electronic music, like, what if you did jump into that? What if you did, learn that work
Hmm.
and perform it? And that could be a really cool and new experience. And, and I think like performers too, like it's really cool, I think, and can help when you sort of like, I guess, are immersed in the um context behind a certain piece of music. So if one of your friends hands you a 12 tone piece to learn and perform, then what if you went and looked up some works by the second Viennese school, Schoenberg, Weber, and Berg, and I bet that you would find at least one piece from there, even if you don't like 12 tone music, that you're interested in, and can, look at the scores, look at how their score is compared to the score that you were handed. And just, I think sort of that process can really help make it feel less scary too.
Hmm. Yeah, like I was in last year I did one of the reading sessions with Green Room, and we were playing a piece by Michael Selvaggi, and it
Mhm.
was he's like very into
Yeah.
noise music, as you
Yeah,
know.
he's like a
Yeah.
spectralist.
Yeah, and so I had never played anything like that, and looking at the score, there was all these quarter tones, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what
Yeah.
this is gonna sound like, but and it ended up being just like a really eye-opening experience to play a style that I'd never played before. And it was, I, at the end of that experience, I was just like, this is really cool.
Yeah, and I hope that you told him that because I'm sure he would
Oh
be
yeah.
super thrilled to hear that. And composers are always really thrilled to hear that kind of thing.
I feel like it would be interesting to play a piece within that style in a high school classroom or an elementary band
Yeah.
orchestra, you know, because it's like, I don't know, I find sometimes students can get discouraged because they may not be at that point where they can like get the sound that they want, or it's like they might still be struggling with certain elements, but it's like, it's supposed to be noise music. And so you don't necessarily have to have the perfect tone. And then you can kind
Yeah,
of focus more on shape.
that's a really
Yeah.
cool concept. I've never thought of that before. That would be great. And then also just like, I think the reason so many university students are scared to touch like spectralism or 12 tone music is literally just because they haven't really seen it or heard it. And
Oh
if
yeah.
we started exposing people to that kind of thing earlier, then that wouldn't be a problem, right? If people just like we learn about, Beethoven and Mozart and Mendelssohn or whatever when we're growing up, what if we also learned about Schoenberg and, Fernie Ho and, whoever else? Um, and you don't have to like them, just like, I'm not a big Mozart fan, but even just like knowing about them and learning about them, I think will help broaden people's horizons and hopefully be sort of less scared of new music. And also, like, a lot of people don't know that you can perform student composer work on your jury if you get permission to. So that's a
Mm.
really cool way to sort of like have a really well rehearsed performance of a student work and then that way you get something out of it, right? At least you're getting graded for it. At least it's not just like, I mean, obviously it's never for nothing, but it feels like you have something to sort of work towards, you know?
Yeah, and it's like it's not an extra thing that you have to juggle in addition to your schoolwork.
Mhm.
It sort of takes a load off. So you can kill two birds with one stone, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's part of your jury, so it's not an extra thing. And then also because it's part of your jury, I feel like people are more likely to maybe like hold themselves accountable for making sure that they really get a good performance of it, which benefits the performer and it benefits the composer. So it's a win-win for
Hmm.
everybody.
Do you have advice for composers who might not play an instrument? Because you mentioned that a lot of your networking is from being part of the ensembles that are playing your music.
Hmm. I think I know that at U of T, um, composers have to play an instrument. Like to get into composition at U of T, I had to audition on voice as well. So I think that's like maybe less of an issue here in Canada, where most schools require even composition students to play an instrument or sing. But I've learned recently that in the US, it's actually not like that, and you can get into composition for most schools without studying an instrument or without having to audition on an instrument. And I find that really interesting because I think that being a singer and like having that piano background too is like such a big part of what I draw on to compose. And I can't even imagine what it would be like to like compose music without actually playing an instrument. So I guess my advice would just be like maybe, start learning an instrument or try to sort of get involved with maybe like learning a bunch of instruments sort of at the beginner level to at least sort of just like understand how they work, or
Mm.
at the very least sort of like getting into, even if it's not on a musical instrument, performing somehow, whether it's, I don't know, dancing or whatever else. But I think just like being able to perform is such an important part of understanding how to compose good music and compose music that is performable and music that is going to come off the way that you want it to come off in performance. Mhm.
And do you ever conduct your own music?
So, conducting is definitely an area that I am less familiar and experienced with. I know a lot of composers do conduct their own music, and it's definitely something that I want to improve on. Um, I only took one conducting course at U of T, which I kind of regret. I wish I had taken two, but composers are required to take at least one. So the
Mhm.
first conducting course I ever took was actually this year with Professor Torrance, and I learned so much from that course. And I definitely want to keep sort of learning how to conduct and getting more comfortable conducting. So yeah, I do think definitely a huge benefit to be able to conduct, because then if you're having music performed with a larger ensemble and they need a conductor, well, then you can do it and you know your score and you know what you want.
Mm.
Um, so I think that's a huge benefit, and it's definitely something that I'm sort of looking to get better at for sure.
I have two more questions.
Oh.
So the first one is, when you were beginning your composition journey, sort of making that decision of like, oh, I want to do this as a career, were there any resources or like pieces of advice that you found out later that's like, oh, I would give this advice to someone who's starting out?
Hmm. Yeah, actually, well, the biggest thing that I would say is that like you can take composition lessons, which is something that I didn't even think of when I was in high school, right? Like I took voice lessons, I sang in choirs, I took theory lessons, I took piano lessons, but I didn't even know that composition lessons were something that you could have. And I didn't, my first composition lessons were in university. Um, so that's definitely, I think, the biggest thing that I would tell like a young aspiring composer is that there are composition teachers out there who you can get composition lessons from. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and it's nice to sort of view composition as something that you can learn and get better at, develop on, as opposed to something that's just sort of comes to you innately. If you want to do it, you can learn how to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice.
Hmm.
And the last question is, um, what do you have any music recommendations to
Hmm.
listeners?
Music recommendations. I feel like whenever anyone asks me about like my favorite music or something, I just like forget every piece of music I've
Oh,
ever listened
same,
to.
same.
Okay, I'm
Yeah,
actually
it
just gonna
doesn't have
pull
to
up.
be your favorite. It could
Yeah,
be anything, even the first thing that
let
comes
me.
to your.
Oh, actually, you know what? Okay, I have a good one. So Kaya Sariejo, have you ever heard that name before?
Yes.
Okay, so
She
she
passed away
actually,
recently, right?
yeah, she passed away recently, which is a huge shame because she was an amazing composer. So I would say anything by her um, is something that I would recommend to listen to. She has some great operas. She has some great art songs, actually. There's one art song set called Quatre Instants. Um, and I don't know if you remember, but we studied it, or were you in
Mm.
Tan or Kuzmenko's class in Theory
I was
4?
in Tan's class.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So we studied it there, and the whole set is amazing. So yeah, I would recommend that for sure.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Bedroom Studios podcast. Don't forget to add this podcast to your playlist, like and follow, and also follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify at Bedroom Studios Podcast. I will also be linking Emily's social media in the description. You should definitely check out her music. And don't forget to follow our playlist of our guest music recommendations. All of these will be linked in the description. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Bedroom Studios podcast. They will be released every other Thursday for season 1. Hope to see you there.